Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we crack open big, complex ideas and really try to hand you the essential takeaways. Today, we're diving into a question that likely hits home for you. I think it does for all of us, really.
Yeah.
Why is tolerance such a struggle?
Yeah.
Think about that moment, maybe you snap, say something you instantly regret, and then feel that awful guilt or even just feeling down, depressed.
Right. We've all been there.
Or just look around, the polarization we see. It feels like it's tearing communities apart globally even. This isn't just academic, is it? It's deeply personal.
Absolutely. It's lived experience.
So our mission right now in this deep dive is to see if we can uncover a kind of unified map, a guide maybe, to understand why our individual limits, our tolerance levels vary so wildly.
And how they get set.
Exactly. How they're forged over a lifetime, and maybe most importantly, what we can actually do about it. How can we foster more tolerance in ourselves and, out in the world?
And it's not just about, wishing for it.
Right.
What we're bringing you today, it actually comes from a pretty sophisticated AI-driven study.
Okay.
And it looked at tolerance not as just one single thing, but as something that emerges, you could say, from this huge interconnected system.
So like a property of the whole system.
Precisely. And to really get it, this study had to pull together threads from, everywhere, from our basic biology genes, neural circuits.
The hardware level.
Yeah, the hardware, all the way up to the big forces.
Yeah.
Cultures, political systems, shared histories. It wasn't just one field.
No.
It was neurobiology, genetics, psychology, sociology, history, philosophy. Even technology ethics got pulled in.
Wow. That's broad.
It had to be.
Yeah.
The goal was really to link the biological, what's physically going on with the psychological and social why.
Okay.
And hopefully, ultimately, chart a clearer path towards maybe a healthier, more tolerant future for all of us.
Yeah. Okay, let's do it. Let's peel back the layers then and get into some of these really fascinating findings from the sources. We're going to start right at the roots, the very beginning.
Sounds good. The foundations.
So if you've ever wondered, why some people just seem naturally more patient or more open and others, well, they have a shorter fuse. It turns out tolerance isn't just something we learn. It's actually woven deep into our biology, shaped by millions of years of evolution.
Right.
Our basic biological hardware actually sets up a kind of foundational blueprint for our social selves.
It absolutely does. And while, there isn't one single tolerance gene, that'd be too easy. Right, no magic bullet.
Yeah.
The sources definitely confirm that core social tendencies, things like empathy or pro-sociality, which is basically just our tendency to act for others' benefit.
Right.
Those things are significantly heritable, passed down.
Okay, so genetics plays a real role.
A moderate role, at least for empathy, according to one big review of twin studies. But even more striking, a landmark study, this one on 7-year-old twins, found a high heritability 69% for this common pro-sociality factor.
69%, wow.
Yeah, covering things like sharing, kindness, helping. So the takeaway is pretty significant.
Yeah.
We aren't born as completely blank slates.
Not at all.
We actually seem to inherit a kind of pro-social personality blueprint to start with.
That's a powerful idea. Okay, so how does that blueprint, that genetic potential, actually translate into, the specific ways our bodies and minds work?
Well, researchers are starting to pinpoint some of the pathways. It's still early days, but
Sure.
For instance, tiny variations in the gene that makes receptors for oxytocin, the bonding hormone.
Yeah, heard of it.
Those variations are linked to individual differences in how empathetic we tend to be. Yeah. And similarly, another gene, this one linked to vasopressin, which is another social hormone that's connected to behaviors like protective aggression. So it's like our genetics kind of fine-tune our social responses, giving us different starting points.
It makes me think of something maybe more familiar, like lactose tolerance. The sources mentioned that.
Oh, yeah.
How this random mutation, basically in one gene, let some ancient humans digest milk as adults.
Right, lactase persistence.
And that gene spread like wildfire in populations where dairy farming took off, because suddenly it was a huge advantage.
It's a fantastic parallel, isn't it? Just like our biology adapted to new foods because the environment changed.
Yeah.
It's very plausible that our genetic predispositions for social tolerance or intolerance were shaped by evolutionary pressures too. Pressures for group cohesion, for survival.
Groups that got along better survived better.
Exactly. Groups that could cooperate probably had a better shot. And this likely led to the very genetic landscape we see today, where different populations might have slightly different baseline social tendencies shaped by their unique histories.
And it also highlights that biology has limits, right? The sources mention purifying selection, which is basically nature weeding out gene variations that are just really bad for survival.
Yeah, severely detrimental ones.
It feels like a kind of biological echo of that philosophical idea we'll discuss later, the paradox of tolerance. Like some things just can't be tolerated if the system is to survive.
That's a really interesting connection.
Right.
And the links run even deeper. Think about physiological intolerances, like food allergies, gluten, peanuts, things linked to specific genes.
Right.
There's a surprising connection emerging between those and mental health challenges, like depression and anxiety.
Really? How so?
It suggests this deep underlying integration. How our bodies manage physical threats, like an allergen, might be linked to how our minds manage psychological and social stress. It hints that maybe these threat management systems are fundamentally intertwined.
Wow. Okay, so genes are the blueprint. The brain must be the machinery, the thing that actually brings the blueprint to life.
Precisely.
Where empathy and aggression actually happen.
Exactly. The sources really paint a picture of this social brain network. That's the arena where tolerance and intolerance play out.
Okay, what are the key parts?
Well, up top, you've got the prefrontal cortex, our executive control center. Hugely important for managing emotions, hitting the brakes on impulses.
Right, self-control.
Yes, and also for mentalizing, which is thinking about what other people are thinking, and overriding our snap judgments, our biases.
And problems there are linked to violence.
Strongly linked, yes. When it's not functioning well, then you have the amygdala, the brain's threat detector, always scanning.
The alarm system.
The alarm system. And interestingly, it can go into overdrive, get hyper-reactive, say, to outgroup faces if you're in a prejudiced environment.
And it can also be underreactive?
Yes. Surprisingly, in conditions like psychopathy, it's often hypo-responsive, underreactive. And then you have areas like the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula. These are really key for interoception, that's your internal sense of your body's state, and for empathy. They literally help us feel with others when we see them in distress.
So it's not just the brain structures, it's also the chemistry, right? Like a whole cocktail of neurochemicals influencing things.
Oh, absolutely. It's an intricate dance. Neurochemicals are constantly tweaking these circuits. Oxytocin and vasopressin, again, they're vital for social bonding, feeling connected.
I love hormones.
Sort of, but here's where it gets really fascinating and maybe counterintuitive. That same oxytocin-fueled empathy, that warmth you feel for your group, it can actually motivate protective aggression towards outsiders if your group feels threatened.
Wow. So love and aggression aren't opposites.
Not necessarily, biologically speaking. They could be two sides of the same coin. Both evolved, likely, to protect what we value: our kids, our tribe, our in-group.
Okay, that's complex. And how does stress fit in? Because you mentioned, the listeners experience the outburst, then guilt, depression. Stress must play a role.
A huge role. The body's stress response system, the HPA axis, cortisol, it's deeply interwoven with these social emotional circuits.
Right.
And a key finding the sources highlight is about individuals with callous traits or psychopathy. They often show a blunted stress response, lower cortisol.
Lower stress.
Lower cortisol response, yeah. Not just when seeing others in distress, but even when they themselves are in stressful situations. It suggests a fundamental difficulty in even registering emotional or stressful signals at a normal level.
Like the alarm system is just off.
Muted. So this leads us somewhere really important, doesn't it? This idea of maybe two quite distinct types of intolerance.
Yes. This research helps us make that distinction. There's what you might call cold intolerance. Think psychopathy.
Okay.
It seems to stem from a deficit of feeling. That under-responsive amygdala, the blunted stress system, it leads to a callous disregard because others' distress just doesn't register emotionally.
Doesn't land.
Right. Then there's hot intolerance. This is more like that protective aggression we talked about, driven by strong feeling.
Exactly. Driven by strong in-group empathy and connection, but it gets directed outward as aggression towards a perceived threat to that group, fueled by those bonding hormones even.
That distinction feels really important. It explains how someone can be, kind and loving within their family, but act with extreme intolerance towards an other, someone they see as a threat. That's very different from calculated disregard.
Very different mechanisms at play. One is a lack of feeling. The other can be driven by strong feelings, just narrowly focused.
And what's really mind-blowing is how dynamic this is. The relationship between our brain and the world outside. Does society actually physically change our brains?
The brain of the world insight is, pretty groundbreaking. It's not just that our environment influences our thoughts, it physically shapes the brain.
How?
Well, one pivotal study, a meta-analysis, found that white participants living in communities with higher levels of explicit racial prejudice showed significantly greater neural activation in specific brain areas, amygdala, prefrontal cortex bits, when they were shown pictures of black faces.
Whoa. So the community's attitude was reflected in their brain activity.
And it was specific to the community-level prejudice, not just other individual factors.
Yeah.
The environment seemed to be tuning their threat response.
That's deeply unsettling. It means intolerance isn't just an idea or an attitude. It can become wired in neurologically.
A kind of embedded, self-perpetuating response, potentially.
It shows how society can literally make this limitless, right down to the neurons firing.
Wow. It really underscores the interplay between biology and environment.
Okay, so if biology sets the stage, let's talk about how experience and upbringing start writing the script. Shifting from the hardware to the psychological software, how does that potential for tolerance actually get cultivated? This speaks directly to that question of raising a healthy and good child, or even just nurturing ourselves.
It's a perfect transition. The foundations for empathy, they're laid incredibly early. Secure attachment is just fundamental here.
Meaning feeling safe and loved.
Exactly. When kids feel safe, loved, supported, they learn to manage their own big emotions. And that ability to self-regulate is what frees them up to respond to others' feelings with empathy, instead of just being overwhelmed themselves.
And it starts really early.
Astonishingly early. Rudimentary empathy, like preferring helpful characters in a puppet show, shows up around 6 months.
No way.
Yeah. And toddlers are actively helping and comforting others by 12 to 18 months. The potential is definitely innate, but it absolutely needs nurturing. It doesn't just automatically flourish.
So parents, caregivers, they're really the primary architects here. What strategies do the sources point to? What actually works?
Several key things come up again and again. First, just modeling tolerant behavior. It sounds obvious, but
Huge.
kids are sponges. When they see parents showing genuine respect and curiosity towards people from different backgrounds, that's a powerful example.
Makes sense.
Second, encouraging open communication. Creating a home where it's safe to ask any question about differences and answering honestly. That's how you head off stereotypes before they take root.
Don't just brush it off.
Exactly. Third, confronting biases. Both our own. As adults, we need to reflect on those and gently but directly addressing a child's discriminatory comments if they make them.
That can be uncomfortable, but necessary.
Very. And fourth, a really simple but powerful one, emphasizing commonalities. Acknowledge a difference, sure, but then pivot. But look at all the ways you're the same, or you both love drawing.
Finding the shared ground.
Yes. And there's another crucial piece here, often missed. Emotional tolerance itself.
Not just tolerance of others, but of our own tough feelings.
That's absolutely right. Your ability to manage your own distress, your own frustration, that distress tolerance is really the bedrock for social tolerance.
How so?
Think about it. If you can't handle your own frustration when things don't go your way, how are you going to handle someone else having a completely different opinion?
Right, you'll just get overwhelmed or lash out.
Exactly. And the neural link is direct. That prefrontal cortex, which gets stronger when you practice emotional regulation, that's also what puts the brakes on impulsive aggression.
So how can parents build that kind of tolerance?
Practical things.
Yeah.
Normalize and label emotions. Wow, I can see you're feeling really frustrated right now, and that's okay to feel frustrated.
Validate the feeling.
Yes.
Yeah.
Guide them towards problem-solving, brainstorm solutions together. Break big problems into smaller steps. And maybe most importantly, model healthy coping yourself.
Show, don't just tell.
Let them see you take a deep breath when you're frustrated and say, okay, I need a minute.
Okay. So that's home life. What about beyond the home? Education, broader exposure.
Super important. Both direct and indirect exposure to diversity really does seem to reduce prejudice. So diverse schools, community activities.
Books, media.
Absolutely. Inclusive books and media are huge. And the sources really stress inclusive and critical education, meaning not just learning about different cultures, but actively challenging stereotypes, teaching critical thinking skills so kids can analyze messages they receive, and maybe even specific programs designed for intergroup contact. It also builds resilience against, extremist narratives.
Equipping them to think for themselves. Now, let's circle back to something you, the listener, mentioned, that raw feeling of saying rude words for no reason and then feeling very bad or depressed. That internal conflict.
Yeah, that's the core of the intolerant mind struggling with itself, isn't it? And it's such a common, painful thing.
So what's going on there?
Well, first, that feeling of no reason. It often does have underlying reasons, maybe fatigue, stress, or just learned habits of reacting. It's rarely truly random.
Okay.
And it's helpful to distinguish. Anger itself is a normal emotion, often a valid response to injustice or threat. Aggression is the harmful behavior. You can feel angry without acting aggressively.
Right. But then comes that awful cycle you described, the anger, then guilt, then shame.
Exactly. For people who value kindness, having an outburst creates this internal clash, cognitive dissonance.
Feels terrible.
It does. And it often leads first to guilt, which is about the behavior. What I did was bad. Guilt can actually be useful. It motivates repair.
Making amends.
Right. But then it can slide into shame, which is global, about the self. I am bad. Shame is nasty. It usually makes you want to hide, withdraw, or even lash out defensively.
And that's the spiral.
That's the potential shame-anger spiral. Feeling ashamed makes you angry, maybe defensively, which leads to more actions you regret, which leads to deeper shame. It's a horrible loop.
And that feeling of being depressed afterwards fits right in.
It's a completely predictable outcome. That inner voice of shame, high self-criticism, it's a major risk factor for depression and anxiety, especially if you hold yourself to high standards.
Which many people who feel bad about outbursts do.
Exactly. Research links being prone to anger with self-contempt. And anger rumination, just replaying angry thoughts over and over, is tied to social problems. So if this sounds like you, please know it's not a character flaw. It's a recognizable psychological process.
One that can be understood and managed.
Absolutely.
Does our basic thinking style play a role here too? Like how flexible we are mentally?
That's a really interesting angle. One large study found links between social intolerance and certain cognitive styles.
Like what?
Things like low cognitive flexibility, difficulty shifting your thinking, high perseverance, which sounds good, but here meant mental rigidity.
Digging your heels in?
Kind of. And also low persistence when faced with complex tasks. It suggests that sometimes intolerance might be a kind of cognitive shortcut.
A way to avoid complexity.
Yeah, an avoidance mechanism. It's mentally easier in the short term to just stick with simple black and white judgments than to grapple with nuance and ambiguity.
Okay, so we've looked deep inside the individual biology, psychology. Now let's zoom out. Let's look at the collective, the group level. How do big structures like culture, religion, politics shape how we divide ourselves or find unity?
This is where the social world really exerts its power. Take religion, for example. It's clearly a double-edged sword.
How so?
Well, on one hand, certain religious doctrines that emphasize, say, absolute truth or one true path can sometimes lead to dogmatism.
My way or the highway.
Pretty much. Viewing opposing beliefs not just as different, but as dangerous falsehoods. And that can fuel prejudice against outsiders, partly to strengthen your own group's identity.
But religion is also a massive source of tolerance and compassion for billions, right?
Absolutely.
Yep.
On the other hand, nearly all major religions have core teachings about love, forgiveness, compassion, often inspired by a loving deity.
The golden rule, things like that.
Exactly. And religion can also provide really valuable structures for positive intergroup contact. Think interfaith dialogue, focusing on shared values. That can be incredibly powerful for building bridges.
Okay. What about politics, especially more secular societies? How does ideology play into tolerance?
There's a concept called the ideological conflict hypothesis, which is pretty useful here.
Okay.
It basically suggests that both liberals and conservatives can be intolerant, but they tend to direct it towards different groups, specifically groups they see as threatening their core values.
So different targets for intolerance.
Right. For example, someone more conservative might react strongly to threats against social order or tradition, while someone more liberal might react strongly to violations of equality or fairness.
And this links to personality, too.
Yeah, there are correlations. Conservatism often links with traits like conscientiousness, orderliness, lower tolerance for ambiguity. Liberalism often links with openness to experience, cognitive flexibility.
And the current political climate.
Well, what we're seeing, sadly, is that increasing political polarization seems to just ramp up a more generalized intolerance for any political difference. It gets harder to even talk across the aisle.
Yeah, feels that way. So beyond ideology, what do broader sociological theories tell us about why groups clash and how they might coexist?
Sociology gives us some key frameworks. Realistic conflict theory, for instance, says conflict often boils down to competition over scarce resources, land, jobs, power.
Makes sense. The solution there.
Often finding superordinate goals, big goals that both groups need to achieve, forcing them to cooperate.
Okay. What else?
Social identity theory highlights our deep psychological need to feel good about our own group. Sometimes, unfortunately, that involves looking down on other groups.
Us versus them.
Right. The solution there often involves recategorization, finding a larger, more inclusive identity that encompasses both groups, shifting from us and them to a bigger we.
Like focusing on being citizens of the same country, maybe.
Exactly. Then there's the contact hypothesis.
Yeah.
Simple idea. Prejudice often comes from lack of positive contact.
So the fix is
Facilitating positive, cooperative, equal status interactions between groups. Just getting people together under the right conditions.
And finally,
The aggressor-defender model. This focuses on how perceived threats can lead to these spirals of demonization where each side sees the other as purely evil. The solution there often involves strong social contracts, trusted institutions that can mediate and de-escalate.
what seems really critical from all this research is that conflicts over what people see as sacred values, religion, core beliefs, national identity are just incredibly difficult to solve. Why is that?
Because compromise feels impossible. For many, compromising on a sacred value isn't just losing something, it feels like a deep moral betrayal.
Like selling your soul.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And these conflicts tend to be way more violent and long-lasting than purely economic ones. The societal costs are just immense.
How so?
Widespread intolerance shreds social cohesion, erodes trust, breaks down networks. It can lead to civic unrest, political violence, even revolution.
And for the groups being targeted.
Terrible health outcomes. More depression, anxiety, chronic stress. Just a huge psychological burden. And economically, it's disastrous. It stifles innovation, wastes talent, restricts opportunities. It harms everyone in the long run.
Let's take a quick step back into history. Has tolerance always been this fraught? Have there been moments of greater understanding?
The struggle is ancient, yes. But so is the idea of tolerance. You see glimpses. King Ashoka in ancient India promoting religious tolerance. The Edict of Milan giving religious freedom in the Roman Empire.
La convivencia in Spain.
Right, that period in medieval Spain with relative coexistence between Christians, Muslims, and Jews. These show tolerance has long been recognized as necessary for peace.
But they seem like exceptions.
Often, yes. History is full of intolerance. Think of Europe's wars of religion in the 16th, 17th centuries. Millions died.
Horrific.
And that devastation led to a kind of exhausted, pragmatic realization with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648.
Which was?
Basically, the understanding that trying to force everyone into religious uniformity just led to endless war and societal collapse. It marked a shift towards seeing tolerance less as a moral virtue and more as a crucial political technology, a practical tool for managing diversity without blowing everything up.
So necessity was the mother of tolerance, in a way.
In many ways, yes. And that pragmatic need really paved the way for Enlightenment thinkers.
Like Locke and Voltaire.
Exactly. John Locke arguing fiercely for separating church and state, protecting individual rights. Voltaire championing freedom of thought, railing against fanaticism. Their ideas laid the philosophical groundwork for modern liberal democracies and the ideal of tolerance we strive for today.
Yeah, when you look at, say, U.S. history, there's often a painful gap between those ideals and the reality on the ground.
Oh, absolutely. It's a stark reminder. Despite founding ideals of liberty, you had early Puritans persecuting dissenters. You had massacres of Native Americans, centuries of enslavement.
Discrimination against wave after wave of immigrants.
Irish, Italian, Chinese, others. The internment of Japanese Americans during WWII. The KKK's long history of terror. It all shows tolerance isn't our natural default setting. It's fragile.
It's something that has to be actively built and defended?
Yes, a hard-won social and political achievement. Maybe even a foundational technology for diverse societies to even function, let alone prosper.
This brings us to a really tricky philosophical point, the paradox of tolerance. What is that exactly?
It's famously articulated by Karl Popper. His point was basically this: unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance.
Meaning?
If a tolerant society extends unlimited tolerance even to those who are fundamentally intolerant, especially if those intolerant groups refuse debate and aim to destroy tolerance itself through violence or suppression.
Then the tolerant society gets destroyed.
Exactly. So Popper argued, paradoxically, a tolerant society must be intolerant of intolerance in order to survive. But, and this is key, only when the intolerant refuse rational argument and actively work to undermine the system using violence or coercion.
So it justifies things like laws against hate speech or inciting violence.
That's the philosophical justification, yes. John Rawls had a similar idea. You only restrict freedom when the basic security and liberty of everyone is genuinely threatened by those who would abolish it.
Okay, that's a powerful concept, but I imagine it gets misused easily.
Hugely misused.
Yeah.
It's crucial to clarify what it's not about.
Right.
True tolerance, remember, is often defined as putting up with beliefs one genuinely objects to, for good reasons. Drawing any line is technically an act of intolerance towards what's beyond the line.
Okay.
However, the paradox of tolerance is absolutely not a justification for everyday rudeness or for shouting down people you disagree with online or at dinner.
It's not a license to be intolerant interpersonally.
Not at all. It's fundamentally about constitutional law, about the self-defense of a liberal democratic state. It's a guide for governance, not personal prejudice.
So how should a proper human culture use it?
Apply it carefully at the legal level to protect the framework of liberty for everyone, while simultaneously promoting robust debate, mutual respect, and interpersonal tolerance at the community level. Protect the space for disagreement. Don't use the paradox to shut it down.
That distinction is vital. Okay, let's shift gears now to something dramatically reshaping our world. Artificial intelligence, a paradigm shift, really.
Undoubtedly, a tool of unprecedented power, for good and potentially for harm.
How can AI help us understand and maybe even mitigate intolerance?
Well, AI can be both a mirror, showing us our own patterns, and a tool. For instance, analyzing online content, the sheer volume is impossible for humans alone.
Right. Content moderation.
AI is critical there. Researchers use machine learning, natural language processing, to detect and categorize hate speech. Methods like rule by example are trying to make it more accurate and transparent.
Transparency is key.
And explainable AI, trying to understand why the AI flagged something, is crucial for building trust. We can't just have black boxes making these calls.
What about using AI more proactively to actually promote inclusivity or empathy? That sounds like the really exciting part.
It is. There are already examples. Global organizations using AI to create safer digital spaces, counter gender bias online, help marginalized groups tell their own positive stories.
And in education.
Things like real-time translation, speech to text. AI is breaking down fundamental communication barriers, which is huge for understanding.
And the frontier, what's cutting edge?
Maybe the most exciting is research using generative AI to directly train empathy.
How?
Imagine AI helping you visualize someone else's perspective in a disagreement, or AI chatbots designed for mental health support that simulate empathetic conversation.
Wow, like an empathy simulator.
Potentially, yes. It could be a powerful training tool for improving human interaction, shifting AI from just policing bad behavior to actively fostering tolerance.
That's incredibly hopeful. But then there's the flip side, the ghost in the machine, the fear of AI in the wrong hands.
Right. And the immediate danger isn't really, Skynet becoming self-aware tomorrow.
Hopefully not.
It's the much more mundane but critical problem of humans deploying flawed AI systems without enough care. The core issue right now is algorithmic bias.
Bias baked into the code.
Baked into the data the code learns from. AI systems learn from the world as it is, or as it was recorded. So if that data reflects historical injustices or stereotypes,
the AI learns them too.
Exactly. It automates and even amplifies those past biases. Remember Amazon's recruiting tool that accidentally penalized resumes with women's college names?
Yeah, I heard about that.
It learned from past hiring data, which was male-dominated. And the danger is these biased outcomes get this fake veneer of objectivity because a computer did it.
Makes discrimination look scientific. Scary.
Very.
Yeah.
And beyond bias, there are other big perils.
Like
AI-powered surveillance. Huge implications for privacy, free expression, and automated misinformation deepfakes.
Yeah.
Targeted propaganda designed to incite hatred, destabilize democracies. These are direct threats to a tolerant, open society.
So, given all this potential and peril, AI ethics and governance become absolutely essential.
Couldn't agree more. And it's not just a tech problem. It needs everyone involved. Policymakers, ethicists, the public.
What are the key principles?
Well, fairness and equity, actively working to find and fix bias in data and algorithms. Transparency and explainability, we need to understand how these systems reach conclusions. No more black boxes.
Accountability.
Absolutely. Accountability and governance. Who is responsible when AI causes harm? We need clear rules and regulations. And crucially, diversity in development.
Having diverse teams build the AI.
Yes. Diverse teams are much more likely to spot potential biases or harmful applications that a homogeneous team might completely miss.
So ultimately, AI is a mirror.
A powerful mirror, reflecting both our intelligence and our biases. It's part of our extended nature now. The biggest danger isn't the AI itself, but our failure as humans to wield this incredible tool with wisdom, foresight, and a strong ethical compass.
Okay, this has been a huge journey across biology, psychology, society, technology, history. Let's try to pull it all together now. Can we synthesize this into a kind of unified schematic, a way to see how all these pieces fit?
I think we can. What's really striking is how these levels build on each other. You could almost see it as a multi-level causal model.
Okay, walk us through it.
So, level 1 is that evolutionary and genetic foundation. Nature's baseline predispositions, in-group cooperation, out-group wariness, that pro-social personality blueprint.
The starting point.
Right. Then level 2, the neurobiological mechanisms. That's the brain's operating system, the social brain network, the neurochemicals, constantly modulating empathy and aggression based on that foundation.
Hardware and initial software.
Kinda. Then level 3 is developmental calibration. This is where early life experiences, especially secure attachment, literally shape that developing brain and tune its stress response. Nurture starts shaping nature. That leads into level 4, individual psychology and behavior. Our unique profile emerges here, our cognitive flexibility, our emotional self-regulation skills, maybe those anger chain cycles we talked about. This determines how we actually behave.
Our personal software and output.
And finally, level 5 is the sociocultural context. This is the big picture. Societal norms, laws, ideologies, history. Defining what's acceptable, drawing group boundaries, telling us who's us and who's them.
Wow, so it stacks up from genes to society.
Exactly. Each level influences the next.
But you mentioned a feedback loop. It's not just one way bottom up.
No, and this is maybe the most powerful and sometimes sobering insight. That top level, the prejudiced society at level 5, it doesn't just influence our behavior, it actively feeds back and shapes individual brains back at level 2.
Like that study on community prejudice and amygdala activation.
Precisely, which then makes prejudiced behavior at level 4 more likely, which in turn reinforces the societal norms at level 5. It becomes a self-sustaining cycle.
A cycle of intolerance.
It can be. And breaking that cycle means we can't just focus on one level. We need multi-level interventions. Changing laws isn't enough if brains are still wired for bias, and changing hearts isn't enough if the social structures are still discriminatory.
Right. You need to tackle it from multiple angles.
Yeah.
So what does this mean practically? Let's build that blueprint for the future. What are the actionable takeaways from this whole deep dive?
Okay, let's distill it. For raising that healthy, educated, and good child, it looks like a dual strategy is key.
Which is?
First, build their foundational emotional tolerance, distress tolerance, healthy coping, problem solving. Give them the inner resources. Second, provide positive, diverse social exposure, real contact, inclusive media, open conversations about difference, build the inner and outer bridges.
Okay, makes sense. What about for us as adults? For our own well-being, especially if we struggle with those moments of anger and regret.
For your own well-being, tackling that anger-shame cycle is huge. That means actively working on emotional regulation, maybe through things like CBT or mindfulness, and practicing self-compassion.
Being kinder to ourselves.
Yes, and learning to differentiate guilt about actions potentially useful from shame about self, usually destructive, and practicing self-forgiveness. It's a skill, not a magic wand.
A journey. Okay. What about creating a better society, a proper human culture, and choosing better leaders?
Cultivating cognitive flexibility seems vital. Teaching critical thinking, encouraging people to hold multiple perspectives, resisting black and white thinking.
Valuing nuance.
Yes. We should probably look for and support leaders who demonstrate high emotional and cognitive empathy, understanding both feelings and different viewpoints. And we need to apply that paradox of tolerance wisely.
The governance piece.
Right. Use legal restrictions carefully against actual violence or attempts to destroy democracy, but always pair that with promoting robust community dialogue and deep interpersonal respect. Protect the space for disagreement.
And finally, zooming out to the biggest picture of society, the planet.
Systematically promoting positive intergroup contact needs to be a priority, making it easier for people from different backgrounds to actually connect and work together.
Investment in education.
Huge investment in inclusive and critical education. Multicultural curricula, yes, but also strong media literacy to fight misinformation. We also absolutely have to demand and enforce ethical AI governance. Transparency, accountability, bias checks need to be non-negotiable.
In connecting social health to planetary health.
It might sound like a leap, but think about it. The core principles needed for social tolerance, cooperation, long-term thinking beyond immediate gain, empathy for others even if they're different or far away.
Yeah.
Those are precisely the same principles we desperately need to tackle huge global challenges like climate change. Intolerance doesn't just harm people, it paralyzes our ability to cooperate on the existential threats we all face. It wastes the very human potential we need most.
And that brings our deep dive to a close for today. As you sit with all of this, consider this final thought. Tolerance isn't just about, being nice. It's not just some lofty moral ideal we pay lip service to. It's actually, perhaps surprisingly, a deeply pragmatic, hard-won human achievement.
It really is. Maybe it's not just a virtue. Maybe tolerance, in its deepest sense, it's actually a prerequisite for our collective survival.
Wow.
It's what allows diverse, complex societies to function, to hold together, to innovate, and ultimately to tackle the massive challenges and opportunities ahead. So we really invite you, just consider how these interwoven levels touch your own life, your community, and maybe ask yourself, what's one small step you could take towards building a slightly more tolerant future, starting today?
This is DigitView.